Imagine walking into a tiny Japanese apartment. There may be barely enough space for a bed, a table, a kitchen, and a few shelves. Yet somehow the room doesn't feel as cramped as you expected. There is no magic trick, no hidden extension, no expensive interior design. Instead, there is a simple habit that changes the way the space feels. And surprisingly, it has less to do with making a home bigger, and more to do with owning less. In Japan, small living spaces are not unusual. In crowded cities like Tokyo, where land is expensive and millions of people live within a limited area, compact apartments are simply part of everyday life. But Japanese homes often approach this limitation differently. Instead of asking, how can I fit more things into this room? The question is often closer to, do I really need this thing here? That small change in thinking can completely transform a home. Think about the average room, a chair that is rarely used, clothes that haven't been worn for months, decorative objects covering every shelf, kitchen equipment bought for one specific occasion, boxes kept because they might be useful someday. Individually, none of these objects seems like a problem, but together they slowly consume something much more valuable than floor space. They consume visual space, and when your eyes constantly encounter objects, your brain has to process all of them. This is one reason a room filled with possessions can feel smaller than it actually is. Japanese minimalism approaches the problem from the opposite direction. Clear the floor, reduce the clutter, give important objects room to breathe. Suddenly, the same apartment can appear larger without changing a single wall. This idea is closely connected to a Japanese concept often associated with simplicity. Ma is difficult to translate with a single English word. It can refer to the meaningful space between things, the pause, the gap, the emptiness that allows everything around it to be appreciated. And this is where the secret becomes interesting. In many homes, empty space is treated as wasted space. A blank wall feels like it needs decoration. An empty shelf feels like it needs something on it. An open corner feels like an opportunity to store another object. But Japanese design often sees emptiness differently. Empty space is not necessarily missing something. Sometimes, empty space is what makes the things you already have feel important. A small room doesn't always need more storage. Sometimes it needs fewer things. And once you understand that, an ordinary apartment can begin to feel surprisingly spacious. But this Japanese habit goes deeper than simply throwing things away. Because the real question is not, how little can I own? It is, what deserves to take up space in my life? And that question leads to an entirely different way of living. The idea becomes even more powerful when you look at how Japanese homes are actually used. In a small home, every object has a relationship with space. A table is not simply a table. It occupies the floor, affects movement, changes what you can see, and determines how easily the room can be used for something else. That is why flexibility becomes so important. One famous example is the traditional Japanese futon. At night, it becomes a bed, but during the day, it can be folded away and stored, allowing the same room to become a living space, a study area, or somewhere for another activity. The room hasn't become physically larger. Its purpose has simply changed, and that is one of the most important principles behind making a small home feel bigger. Don't let one object permanently control the space. The same thinking appears in Japanese furniture and storage. Instead of allowing possessions to spread across every visible surface, things are often given specific places. When an object has a home, it doesn't need to remain on the floor or on a table just because you might use it later. This creates something that modern homes often struggle to achieve.
If not,
visual calm.
let it go.
Walk into a room where every object is competing for your attention, and the space can feel chaotic. Walk into the same sized room where only a few things are visible, and your eyes can travel further. That distance creates the illusion of openness. There is another important detail. Japanese homes often make careful use of vertical
Cluttered
and hidden
units
storage.
block up your space.
Instead of filling the
Moving them
center
to
of the
walls
room with
opens it up.
cabinets and furniture,
Now you have room to breathe.
storage can be pushed toward walls, tucked into built-in spaces, or kept behind doors. The goal isn't simply to store more. It is to keep the main living area visually clear. And this is where a small home can teach us something surprisingly useful. We often think organization means finding a place for everything we own. But sometimes the better solution is deciding that we don't need everything we own. Because storage can hide clutter,
Time to clean
it cannot
this place
eliminate
up.
the psychological weight of unnecessary possessions. Imagine opening
that is that.
a cupboard and seeing dozens of things you haven't touched in years, even if the cupboard is perfectly organized. those objects still occupy mental space. This is why Japanese-inspired decluttering often begins with a simple decision. Keep what is useful, keep what is meaningful, and question everything else. This doesn't mean living in an empty white room with nothing personal around you. Japanese homes can be warm, natural, and deeply personal. Wood, plants, ceramics, fabrics, books, photographs, and everyday objects can all have a place. The difference is that each item is allowed to matter. Instead of hundreds of objects shouting for attention, a smaller number of objects can create character. And that changes how the entire room feels. But there is one final habit that makes this philosophy much easier to maintain. It isn't about buying clever furniture. It isn't about renovating your apartment. It is something much simpler. It is the habit of putting things back. And that tiny daily action may be the real secret behind the spacious feeling of a small Japanese home. Putting things back sounds almost too simple to matter. But in a small home, it can make an enormous difference. When every object returns to its place after use, clutter has less opportunity to accumulate. A cup goes back into the kitchen. Clothes return to the closet. The futon disappears after sleeping. The table becomes clear again. And within minutes, the room can return to its original state. This creates something more important than cleanliness. It creates freedom of space. You can walk through the room without stepping around things. You can sit down without moving piles of objects first. You can look across the room and actually see the floor. And when more of the floor is visible, the room naturally feels larger. But there is also a psychological effect. A cluttered environment constantly reminds you of unfinished tasks. A jacket lying on a chair says, "Put me away." A pile of papers says, "Deal with me." A crowded countertop says, "Clean me." One object may not matter, but dozens of small visual reminders can create a feeling of pressure. Keeping surfaces clear removes many of those signals. The room becomes quieter. And when the environment feels quieter, the space can feel larger. This is why the Japanese approach is not really about minimalism for the sake of appearance. It is about making the home work better for the person living inside it. A small apartment cannot give you more square meters, but it can give you more usable space. And that distinction is powerful. You don't necessarily need a bigger bedroom. You may need fewer things competing for the bedroom space. You don't necessarily need a larger living room. You may need furniture that can disappear when it isn't being used. You don't necessarily need another cupboard. You may need to question what is already inside the cupboards you have. The habit begins with a surprisingly uncomfortable question. If I didn't already own this, would I choose to bring it into my home today? If the answer is no, perhaps it doesn't need to stay. Over time, this creates a different relationship with possessions. You stop measuring your home by how much it can hold. You start measuring it by how easily you can live inside it. And that may be the deepest lesson behind the Japanese approach to small homes. Space is not only something measured in meters. It is also something you create through your choices. Every object you remove creates a little more visual room. Every surface you clear creates a little more calm. Every item you return to its place creates a little more freedom. And suddenly the walls haven't moved. The apartment hasn't grown, but somehow your home feels bigger. Perhaps that's the real Japanese secret. A spacious home doesn't always begin with more space. Sometimes it begins with learning to leave some space empty.